Okay, so I think we can start now. First of all, a very warm welcome to Dr. Amul Dege, and hello to all our dear listeners. On behalf of the Institute Technical Council, I welcome you to the But What Exactly series. Um, what exactly is research in particle physics? So today we have with us a very exciting speaker, Dr. Amol Dege. His talk, as you can see, is entitled From Engineering Physics at IIT Bombay to Research in High Energy Physics. So I will introduce him in a formal way and then maybe a little informal way. Dr. Amol Dege is a professor of physics at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in the Department of Theoretical Physics. He works in the area of high energy physics, which aims to understand the nature of elementary interactions by studying properties of elementary particles. His recent research has focused on the particles known as neutrinos, their nature and the role that they play in astronomy and cosmology. He looks for signals of new physics at experiments like the Large Hadron Collider at CERN and in the particles that come from the sky. So Sir has received a large number of awards in his illustrious career. He has received the Institute Silver Medal from IIT Bombay and the World Lab CERN John Bell Scholarship. He was the leader of the Max Planck India Partner Group in neutrino physics and astrophysics for 5 years. He has been elected as a fellow of the Indian Academy of Sciences and the Indian National Science Academy. He has won the Swarna Jayanti Fellowship from the Department of Science and Technology and is the recipient of the prestigious Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Award. He has also been awarded the Distinguished Alumnus Award from our very own IIT Bombay. So after that very long list of accolades, I also want to add on a personal note that Dr. Dege, actually, I met him around 6 years ago when he handed me my prize for an exam in Maharashtra known as the Homi Bhabha Young Scientist exam. And I remember getting my silver medal from him, and that was sort of the point where I realized that, okay, science is a thing. And, that was a point where I seriously considered a career in science. So, yeah, this is exciting for me on a lot of fronts, but a very, very warm welcome to you, sir, and we are very happy to have you today. With that, I hand over you the mic and the stage, the virtual stage, and please begin. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chatrali. It's good to be talking to people that we have met before. So I guess everybody is perhaps had their hopes, and so am I. But okay, we are gathered again together here, and let me try to tell you something about what a career in high energy physics is like. But before I start, let me start in slightly more general sense, in the sense of what is it that people normally do after doing engineering physics from IIT Bombay, which is what I do. So this was my class of EP 1992. You see our combined picture in 1992 on the left-hand side of the screen, and we again met after 25 years for our silver jubilee, and you will see all of us standing somewhere outside the physics department. Okay, so all of us have taken slightly different paths. So before I start telling you about what exactly I did, I'll tell you about different paths that we took. So, for example, 4 of us from our batch of 14 are now professors of physics. It's a coincidence that 3 of us happen to be in TIFR, but we took completely different paths in a completely different domains. This is Kedar Dambe, who is a theoretical condensed matter physicist. This is myself, who does theoretical high energy physics. And this is Professor Arnab Bhattacharya, who does semiconductors, that is experimental condensed matter physics. He's also perhaps very well known, the science outreach leader in Mumbai and even in India. You might have heard of the Chai and Wai series. This is Dipankar Datta, who is working in experimental high energy physics, and he's at the Michigan State University. Two of us actually became faculty members in electrical engineering. One of us, who's Ashwin, who is in fact now a prof in IIT Bombay in electrical engineering department, but that he did after completing a PhD in physics. This is Anil Prabhakar, who actually did a PhD in electrical and now is electrical engineering professor in IIT Bombay. There are some people who actually changed the subject in a sense. This is Kaushal, who did a PhD in mathematics and now is a professor in Institute of Science, Bangalore. This is Ajay, who did his master's in physics, then shifted to mathematics, did MSc again and PhD in mathematics, and then now he teaches in the business school in Georgia. This is Lalita, who did a master's in electronics and communications, then went to industry, came back to do a PhD in electrical computer science, and now is a faculty member in the Arizona State University. Some of us went to industry. One went to Texas Instruments. Another did a master's in physics and then went to industry in US. A third did a PhD in physics and then now works with GE as in R&D division. One became entrepreneur and now is again back to the corporate world, Infosys. And one actually did master's in astrophysics, then shifted to linguistics, and now works as a counseling psychologist. So as you see, even though we all were part of the same class in engineering physics, we ended up taking a much wider set of careers in our path. So when I was told that I have to talk to you about careers, I decided to contact all my classmates and try to find out from them what exactly they are doing. One of them, who's Lalita here, actually was very proactive and actually sent me a video. And she requested I show you the video, and maybe you can hear for the next 2 minutes about what she has to say.
Hi everybody, my name is Lalita Shankar and I was a graduate of Professor. I joined IIT in 1988 and I joined engineering physics a year later than I IT was a very intense experience for me and quite isolating. And I think I've had a beautiful path, lots of. And now I'm as part of my IT. And one thing I did after my bachelor's, I thought I was going to go like most others, and I did a master's.
If I may interrupt,
Yes.
a lot of people
Yeah.
are not able to hear the audio clearly. It's cracking.
Okay. So in this case, let me stop the video here. Maybe the bandwidth is too much. Let me explain what she's doing. So she did her engineering physics. Then she did a master's in electrical engineering. She went and worked with Polaroid. Then she worked with AT&T Bell. After which she again came back to academia, and now she is working as a faculty member in Arizona State University. So I will skip that since people are having difficulty with this, and okay. We also had, of course, the MSc batch, which also graduated with us, and we all were quite close. Let me tell you what they have been doing. So two of them are now physics professors, one in IISER Pune and one in the University in Singapore. Two of them joined the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, BARC. One of them did a PhD in physics and joined an IB school, and now she's also in professional service. Remember, this was 92, so the economy was just getting opened up. Two of us, our classmates, actually joined, they started software companies. Now they're owners of the company. One started a software startup and has started many companies. One is a quant analyst on Wall Street. One is into oil exploration and innovation. One conducts IIT coaching classes. One is the CEO in the public sector company in solar energy, and one is a freelance writer. So, in fact, compared to all of them, in some sense, my travel has been more one-dimensional. But as I will try to tell you, it wasn't exactly one-dimensional because things change even if you continue along the same path as simply doing things. So, what happened during my path? I'm not an expert in giving career talks. So, what I will try to do is I will try to tell you about my career path, and I will tell you about the lessons that I learned while going along that career. So it sort of started in 1992 when I got my BTech from IIT Bombay and went to the University of Chicago. After completing my PhD in the University of Chicago in 97, I went and joined ICTP, which is International Center for Theoretical Physics. It's in Trieste in Italy as a postdoc. Then I spent a couple of years in CERN in Geneva, which has the Large Hadron Collider Accelerator, as you know. I spent a couple of years in Max Planck Institute in Munich, which is in Germany. And then in 2003, I was back sort of very close to where I started from, which is in TIFR, not very far from IIT Bombay. This was not just a transition in space, but somehow my interests also kept on changing. When I was in IIT Bombay, I mainly did mathematical physics. When I joined Chicago, since Chicago has a laboratory called Fermilab, which at that point of time was the world's biggest particle accelerator, I learned about polar experiments when I was in Chicago. I also learned about what's called as phenomenology, which means that you connect theory with observations and experiments. When I shifted to do my postdocs, I learned about these particles called neutrinos and then got sort of pulled into research on neutrinos. I will have some stories about them to tell you in the rest of my talk. In Geneva, of course, I was working with the Large Hadron Collider, which was built at that point of time, not when we had started. In Max Planck, I met a lot of astrophysicists, and then I got into this area called as astroparticle physics, which tries to look at particles, elementary particles that are very, very small, but finally from that, we try to decipher or infer about things happening at cosmological scales. So it's connecting very small scales to very, very large. Once I came to TIFR, I got involved in doing experiments, science communication, and education, which are in some sense new things that I do. So it does keep on happening that what you do very often is not something that you started off thinking that I will do, but depending on what is the atmosphere around you, you choose to do certain things. Let's see what happened. In IIT, I was kind of clueless, and I just learned whatever I could find to do. So we used to have a third-year seminar, perhaps you will still have it. I did that in the Department of Mathematics, because at that point of time, I was really interested in pure mathematics, and I did tensor analysis with Protocol Shastra. During my BTech project, I worked with Urjit Yajnik, who I guess many of you will know, at least those who are in this department. And I worked on general relativity and gravitational waves. Gravitational waves, as you know, were discovered only about 2 years ago. I had no idea that it's going to be a big thing when I did this. Not that I understood much in them when I did that. I was just doing it. During the summer of my final year, I worked in TIFR with Professor Agarwal on testing properties of gas in what are called as proportional counters. These counters were being designed for AstroSat, which is India's first satellite purely for scientific purposes. It was sent in the sky in 2015. It has been about 5 years and it has been working fine. Again, at that point of time, I had no clue that after 20 years, this satellite is going to go up in the sky and it actually get some very important data. So sometimes you just do things because you are curious and find them interesting without really knowing that they are going to lead you to something very, very simple. So 1992, I left IIT and then I joined University of Chicago, and that is where my journey in high energy physics began. So because I'll be using a lot of language of high energy physics, I will tell you something about what's called as a standard model of particles. Maybe many of you already know of this. It's just a reminder. So we know that everything that's around us is essentially made up of 6 kind of quarks. These are the particles that undergo strong interactions. Then there are 6 kinds of leptons, which do not undergo strong interactions. So among them, we know electron very well. Protons and neutrons are made up of combinations of up and down quarks, and many of the other particles are unstable. I will come to neutrinos sometime later. There are 4 kinds of interactions, as we know. If we leave out gravity, we have strong, weak, and electromagnetic. Strong interactions are mediated by forces by particles called as gluons. Weak interactions are mediated by particles called as W and Z bosons. Electromagnetic are by photons. And then there is this thing called Higgs boson. Higgs boson gives mass to all the particles. That's a standard model of particles. As I will tell you later, this model was not complete when I was doing my PhD, and that's what made my theory. So my first exposure to particle physics was actually in my first winter in Chicago. Now, you perhaps know that one thing about Chicago is that it's a very, very cold place. In winter, it's extremely gloomy. Sun is not there in the sky for almost 4 months. It's essentially, you don't want to go out. Fortunately, our university had what was called as what we used to call as the basement experimental physics course, which meant that during these 4 months, you sit in the basement of a lab, which is therefore quite warm. You try to find out things to do with the apparatus that exists there in the basement. What I found, or what I liked, is that there were lots of really big photographs of what are called as cloud chambers. These photographs are photographs taken of particles traveling through the chambers, and the idea was that you look at the photographs and try to find out what are the particles traveling through. A typical photograph that you see is something like what you see here on the left hand side. Okay, essentially you see almost nothing. To look at that, you need to have some vision. You have to know how to exactly do that. Turned out that the only person who knew how to read that had left physics and now become a paleontologist. We actually found him out, and he actually taught me how to look at these particles, how to identify what these particles are. So from this picture, for example, what you identify is what is on the right hand side, and you see lots of particles going around. Some of them are P, which are protons. Some of them are mu, which are muons. Pi that you see are pions, and so on and so forth. Once you try to understand how these particles behave, these pictures are almost like photographs of your friends. Look at the faces and you identify what's happening instantaneously. And that is something that was my first exposure to particle physics, and that is something that got me really interested in doing particle physics. So from the mesh you see on the left hand side, we actually can decipher this list of various decay processes that you see here. Just deciphering this is like a detective story, and this is something that started in 1950s and 60s but continues even till now. Okay? So that's the detective part of doing particle. The part that I really tried to work on for my PhD was about symmetries in particle physics and their breaking. So what kind of symmetries? So we all know mirror symmetry, right? I mean, we see in the mirror, and apart from a left-right exchange, we see that our image in the mirror looks very similar to us. This would happen almost the same with elementary particles. The question we ask is, are the laws of physics the same in the mirror universe as in our universe? So for example, let me say I did an experiment in my lab and I took a film of this experiment. At the same time, I had a very big mirror in my lab, and I again took the film in the mirror of the same experiment. If I send you these two different films, can you identify which film was taken in my lab and which was taken in the mirror? This question is called as the question of mirror symmetry or parity symmetry. So look at this picture. This picture that you see on the left top is a painting by MC Asia, who draws very nice complicated paintings. If you do a mirror inversion of this, you get the right hand side painting, which is called as P. P stands for parity or mirror symmetry. Okay, so this is just a mirror image of this. And the question is, does nature obey this symmetry? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is, what if I call positive charges as negative and negative as positive? So what if my protons were negatively charged particles and electrons is positively charged particles? This is called as the charge parity or the charge symmetry. It's like going from top to bottom. So what I've done here is replace white by black, black by white. It's like changing charges from positive to negative. And this is called as what happens after C symmetry. It was observed by the time I joined my PhD that both C and CP were violated, okay, to a very large extent. As you see, these two pictures, the P and C, don't look similar to what the original picture. However, now I do two things. I do parity symmetry, transformation, and charge. Okay, so now I go to what's called as CP, the right bottom. So I change left, I change black to white and left to right. And you will see that now this picture looks quite similar to the original picture. This is analogy, but in physics, people were wondering if it is possible that C and P are symmetries which don't hold, but a combined symmetry CP actually holds. And this was a question which was unknown at the time that I joined. So, what hooked me to particle physics is actually a particular talk by one of my professors, which was given for the first year graduate students. What was the talk about? The talk told us about open questions. What are the open questions? The open question was, is this violation of charge parity symmetry direct in nature? What this means, is it possible that I have a state which is even in charge parity, and suddenly this state changes to state which is odd in charge. So if this happens, it means that laws of physics do not obey this particular symmetry. At the end of this talk, I went to the speaker and asked the speaker, how will we know? Because this was posed up as an open question. The answer was quite interesting. The answer was not, okay, no, maybe we read some books and find out. The answer was this. The answer was, no one knows, and we will be the first. And it's because this person, Yao Hua, was the one involved in building up the experiment to answer this question precisely. The experiment will be built at Fermi. So this was the inspiring answer, which actually sort of hooked me to particle physics. And I joined this experiment called as the K-TeV experiment, which was in Fermi. This experiment, after about 10 more years, resolved the issue and actually said that yes, actually this happened. Fortunately, I got my PhD, in fact, even before that. I didn't have to wait for 10 years to do that. However, it was good that I was involved in the experiment in its initial stages. So actually, work at the level of connecting wires and cleaning detectors and so on and so forth, which turned out to be useful in the future. I worked on the experiment for about a year or so, and later on I shifted to more theoretical studies of signal violation, not exactly experimental. So what does phenomenology mean? That word has come earlier, and that's something that I describe myself as. So let me take a detour and tell you what a phenomenology is. So as we know, there is a standard model of particle physics. What we try doing is we come up with ways of testing the standard model, because we want to discover something new. So we want to find out where this standard model falls short. We then try to identify those processes or those reactions that can distinguish between different theories. Because finally, we want to say, if standard model is wrong, then what is the correct theory? What we do then is we develop techniques of analysis that can separate signal from background. See, as you saw in the earlier picture of cloud chamber, lots of the things that you saw there were just junk. Only a particular lines were the lines that represented particles that are of interest. So to do that, we have to develop analysis techniques. Then we propose new experiments that can help us doing this, and we have to analyze the feasibility of the experiments. Because remember, experiment in high energy physics actually require lots of people and lots of money. Usually worldwide, there are only a few experiments that can be done. Therefore, you cannot just suggest experiment that you feel will be interesting, but you have to see if it is feasible to be done in near future. Then you convince your experimentalist friends that what you're proposing is interesting, meaningful, possible, and worthwhile. Because if they take up your idea, they are going to spend a few years of their lives trying to find the data and see if what you suggest is correct. Okay, so this is essentially what a phenomenology is. And that's the job that I have been doing for last more than 20 years. This saga of CP violation that I mentioned to you had a reasonably good ending. I got my PhD in 97. In 2002, as I said, Kate showed that indeed there is CP violation. When this was confirmed, there were many experiments that were performed, mainly in USA and Japan. In USA, in the Stanford laboratory called as SLAC, and in Japan in the KEK laboratory. And it was quite good to see that some of the experiments actually used the analysis techniques that I had proposed earlier. These experiments, these two, actually confirm the theoretical mechanism of CP violation, which is called as the Kobayashi-Masuno. Let's not go into what the mechanism is, but let me just tell you that in 2008, these two gentlemen actually got the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the origin of broken symmetry, which is the CP symmetry, which predicts the existence of at least 3 families of quarks in it. So I showed you that there are 3 families of quarks. Those 6 quarks are divided into 3 families. However, when these two gentlemen proposed this in 1972, only 2 families were known. So therefore, this was a great discovery which got Nobel Prize in 2000. This was my saga about particle theory. For those who have a rosy picture, let me warn you, graduate school and PhD research is hard work. Postdoc is even harder and has more stress. So what sustains us? By us, I mean researchers who are doing research in high energy physics. The first thing and foremost that you need is you must love what you do every day. If you don't love that, things really become very, very stressful and boring, very, very easy. Okay, so do it only if you really, really love it. However, what you look for is the following. You look for those moments when you figure out something and then you know that in this whole world, perhaps you are the only one who has figured it out. Okay. And then, of course, we write it into paper and people will read it, blah, blah, blah. However, there are some moments when you are the only one who have that particular special knowledge, and those moments have a very exhilarating feel to it, and those are the moments for which many of the scientists actually live. Apart from that, overall, there is this feeling that as a scientist, you participate in the creation of knowledge. So it is not reproduction of knowledge, like you read in a textbook and write something down. It is not application of knowledge, which is also a good aim in its own, but this is creation of knowledge in the sense you create something which was not known earlier to mankind in the world. And I think that's really something that sustains you even through the hard work that you need to do as a researcher. Apart from this, there are a couple of more particle theory discoveries that I got to experience very, very closely. One was the discovery of top quark. So I showed you the standard model, which had 6 quarks. Only 5 were discovered when I started my PhD. However, in 1995, the experiment at Fermilab, which collided protons, which come here from the left, antiprotons, and this collision produces top quarks, which are found through the particle that is nuclear. Of course, you don't see this picture. Okay, that's what we think happens. What you see is what happens on the right-hand side. This is the electronic detector, and all that you see here, those red lines and blue lines and green lines, are just electronic signals. Okay, so the job of physicists is to look at the electronic signals and from them figure out what actually happened. Okay? Again, this is an extension of the detective story that I mentioned. In 2012, very recently, there was the discovery of the Higgs boson. Okay? Again, these two pictures that you see are the photos of detectors and the particles in the detectors, and these act as photographs of your friends, in this case, the Higgs boson. For this discovery, in 2013, Anglais and Higgs got a Nobel Prize, and you notice that the Nobel Prize says it was for the discovery of a mechanism that contributed to our understanding of the origin of mass of subatomic particles, because of course Higgs is essential for giving mass to electrons, for example. But what's also important is that it was recently confirmed to the discovery of this particle by these two particular experts. These are collaborations. They involve about 3,000 people each, because you need such people and so many people to be able to figure out what's happening inside the frequencies of this detector. So I wasn't involved directly with Higgs discovery, but I was a part of CERN when LHC was being built, and my theoretical work does involve using the data from Large Hadron Collider to talk about it. Okay, so this ends the initial half of my talk, and this was about my experiences in Collider. If there are any questions or any suggestions, then I can take them for a couple of minutes. Otherwise, I will start with the story of Newton Rosen. Should I continue, or is there something you want to Chetrali?
Yeah, so okay, there is a question from my side first. So you mentioned that you were at CERN when the LHC was being built. So I was wondering, how is it like, because to be part of such a huge collaboration, especially at the stage where it's actually being built, what was that like?
I don't know how to describe this. I actually am a theorist, so I'm not really involved in building of this. However, remember, building of this actually meant setting up apparatus in the tunnel whose length is more than 20 kilometers. And inside this huge tunnel, you install intricate apparatus. The tunnel, by the way, is more than 100 meters underground. So you have to go down there and then try to construct. There's a lot of anticipation because this is the initial stages of building and you do not know whether it will succeed or not. You believe in the fact that every one of these 1,000 people in the collaboration will do their job exactly, precisely well, so that when the machine starts, it will give you the results that you're looking for. Okay. So working in big collaborations is really a challenging task. Fortunately, I'm a theorist, so I can be slightly out of that, and I could work on exactly what I want to do. But a collaboration is really a nice, well-oiled machine, in which success of every part depends on what the remaining 3,000 people are all doing.
Thank you. Okay. There's another question from Samir. He asks, did you have a clear understanding while you were at IIT on what area you want to pursue a PhD on at the University of Chicago?
No, I had no clue. Absolutely no clue. During our days, there was not a course of high energy physics in the Department of Physics. So I did not even know much about high energy physics. I think it is very important wherever you go after your BTech or MSc is to keep your eyes open and try to see what's happening around you. And you see what excites you. It is not a good idea to make up your mind just while doing your bachelor's about what you're doing. The more interest you are, the more things you can connect. Because the future is going to be about being able to connect knowledge from different domains, okay, and that makes you unique. The two domains that you can join makes you unique. So I had no idea, and I would suggest don't try to grab onto one idea and get fixated. once you start doing further research, you figure out what is it that.
Okay, thank you. There are more questions, but should I take them now or later?
Maybe we'll take them later. I
Okay.
tell you a story, and then you perhaps will find some common.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
So remember, this is about 1998. I have finished my PhD. My PhD has been in colloidal physics, and I know sort of what happens in the domain of particle physics. I have no idea about neutrinos. So this is 1998, and this is the background of neutrinos and what people knew about them. That's what was known. I showed you neutrinos. They are of course part of standard model. They happen to be the second most abundant particles in the universe. As we are sitting in our rooms, inside our houses, more than 1 trillion of them are passing through our bodies every second. So they're actually very large in number. They are responsible for making the sun shine. Sun will not shine without neutrinos, and they are the ones that make the stars explode. However, they happen to be extremely hard to detect and explore, and that's what makes them interesting. In 1998, there were 3 unsolved puzzles in neutrinos, which had been bothering scientists for decades. So, for example, there was a puzzle called as the solar neutrino puzzle. It basically said that the number of neutrinos coming from the sun should actually match the energy coming from the sun, and it was not matching. Okay, it turned out that number of neutrinos detected was much smaller than the number of neutrinos that we expect. Second puzzle, which was there since 1980s, was that if you look at neutrinos that are produced in the atmosphere of the Earth, you have some idea of how many you will see, and turns out that many of them were lost. In fact, you could see that if they were coming from the Earth, they seem to be lost, but you could not figure out where they went. The third puzzle was around 1994. People observed neutrinos from accelerators and tried to detect them and tried to count them, and again they saw that some of them were missing. So these 3 puzzles were the puzzles that were making scientists wonder for many, many years. All the possible solutions of these puzzles led to physics beyond the standard model of particles. One of those solutions was that perhaps neutrinos may have mass. In the standard model, it so happens that neutrinos cannot have mass. Higgs boson cannot give mass to neutrinos. Answer is a bit technical, we won't go into that, but just take this one. And therefore, you will have to go beyond the standard model and have a new theory of the world if you wanted to solve this theory. So at this point of time, I was in ICTP in Trieste. I was surrounded by stalwarts in neutrino physics, but my own particular feeling was that these puzzles are due to statistical fluctuations. You counted 1,000, maybe somehow detectors had some problems. So it's possible that was the problem. There can't be a problem with you. So I continued to work in the area of colloidal physics and ignored the area of neutrinos. However, I promised the people around me that if once I become sure that they have mass, I will start working with it. This is what I call as a fatal transparency, which sort of changed my life for the better. In 1998, there was a neutrino conference in Japan where this particular slide was shown. This was a transparency, that slide, that was a transparency time. And without going into detail, let me tell you, focus you on this thing called as 6.2 sigma, which basically meant that there was a chance of only 1 in 10 million or less that this observation is not done. And this essentially convinced everybody that neutrinos really do oscillate, they really do have mass, and you cannot escape. Again, during those times, you could not see proceedings of conference on the web directly. So the conference was during a week. The next Monday morning, when I was sitting in my lab, my colleague who had gone for the conference came. is a quite senior person, Alexei Smirnov. He came, he had taken a photocopy of his transparencies. He sort of came and gave it to me and said, Amol, here you go. Okay. And I still remember that moment as the moment that sort of changed the track of the research that I will be doing from here onwards. I still, of course, have continued with doing colloidal physics, but then things have changed into neutrinos. So what do people do in neutrinos? They do experiments, detect neutrinos, and measure their properties. They do phenomenology, which means they connect these properties with observables. They do theory, which means that they try to explain why they have mass, because now we know that standard model is not complete. So the theory has to tell you what's going to happen to this. And then you do astroparticle physics. What this means is that you can use neutrinos coming from stars to explore what happens inside these stars. And that's the thing that I really like. So the reason I got into astroparticle physics is essentially because of this process. Okay? And again, there are stories attached to this. There are supernovae. You might have heard that supernovae happen when stars explode. A kind of supernovae are called as core collapse supernovae, and they are special in the sense they are very large sources of neutrinos. Within 10 seconds, they release about 10 to the power 57 neutrinos. So therefore, if tomorrow supernova explodes in our galaxy, we can observe the neutrino and we can tell very important information about neutrino properties and about supernova astrophysics. Again, supernova astrophysics are questions that have been bothering people for almost thousands of years. The Crab Nebula that we see today came from a supernova which was observed by astronomers on Earth in the year 1054. Okay, so more than 1,000 years ago. However, the problem is that in our galaxy, a supernova is supposed to explode only once in 30 years. Again, this was the reason that initially made me a bit wary about trying to work on supernova neutrinos because, well, no, something is happening in 30 years. Why wait till that much? In colliders, no, things are happening every year. But again, at this point of time, my colleague came up with this quote. He said, okay, let us now write a paper that will be read by people for the next 30 years. Okay. Indeed, we did read such a paper. Indeed, that is still being read by people, and it happens to be one of still my very well cited papers. So the idea is research is not just about what's happening now in the next 2 years. It's also about trying to imagine something that is going to happen in the next 30 years, next 40 years, and 90 years. Okay. Doing research, of course, has many occupational hazards. There's always a fear of getting scooped. Because if you're working on an important problem, it also means that everywhere around the world, many people are working on this problem. So this fear is sometimes irrational and sometimes also real. In fact, while we were writing this earlier paper on supernova, suddenly something came on, something was published, which I thought that was very close to what we were doing, and I thought we were scooped. So everything that I did for last 6 months was completely in vain. I actually sat without sleeping for the next 3 days and completed writing this paper. Okay, my friends actually used to come and give me food to eat and things to drink, and I would just sleep on that. I don't advise you to do that. Okay, never do that. Maybe once in your life, but not after that. But it happens. It's occupational hazard. This fear of getting scooped is sometimes real, and well, that's a part of life. However, how you react to this and how you continue research shows your character. So that part is very, very important. Later on in my life, I got scooped, I don't know, maybe 10 times. But now I don't care. If I get scooped in one case, I said, I don't care. I will go and work on something else, and I have something very. You will always be fraught with what is called imposter syndrome. This is very common in physics and while you do PhD, simply because you are always surrounded by brilliant minds and you wonder if you belong. This perhaps many of you experience when you join IIT after coming from your school. in school, you are sort of maybe one of the best people around, and you come to IIT and you see, oh, but everybody around me is so much better than I am. It's called an imposter syndrome, and I guarantee you that all the people, however good their credentials look now, always suffer by this imposter syndrome. Okay, so having trust in your abilities is very, very crucial. And therefore, loving the process is very important. And even if some work that you did for 6 months goes to waste because somebody else did it already before you, it's perhaps something that you should just go to waste. The neutrino saga, of course, also had high points. There have been 2 Nobel Prizes during my career, which have gone to neutrinos and to objects on which I have actually worked. Of course, not compared to what the gentleman had. In 2002, Davis and Koshiba got Nobel Prize for detecting neutrinos. Davis for detecting neutrinos from Sun, and Koshiba for detecting neutrinos coming from stars. In 2015, which is not very long ago, these 2 gentlemen, Kajita and McDonald, got Nobel Prize for discovering of neutrino oscillations, which showed that neutrinos were mass. This fatal transparency that I showed you earlier was the one that was made by Kajita, so that's his handwriting and figure that he made by his hand, which is still reading. In this neutrino saga, you perhaps know that India is taking its important steps. We are going to have India-based neutrino observatory very soon. It will be in Tamil Nadu, in what's called as Bodhi West Hills near Madurai. We will dig a very thin tunnel inside here and go to a location where on every direction that you see, you have at least 1 kilometer of rock. And what that does, that it absorbs all cosmic rays and makes you a very, very pure atmosphere where you can detect neutrinos. Inside that, we will put the largest electromagnet in the world. This electromagnet has a mass of 50 million kilograms, or what's called 50 kilotons. And this is the biggest detector in the world, which can distinguish between neutrinos and antineutrinos. Once it is built, it's going to be run for decades, so it is going to be a lifelong project, at least for 20 years. INO as an experiment has many layers of things that you can do, and I will just display them in front of you just to give you a feeling. Don't really have to read everything that you just like. These are all questions that are important in the case of neutrinos. You of course find out the properties of neutrinos. However, by using properties of neutrinos, you can find out properties of Earth. You can do tomography of the Earth. You can look for physics beyond the standard model. You can look at things like magnetic monopoles that physicists only think about but have no way of detecting yet. A detector like this is a good detector to have, which will just keep on observing the sky, because events happen in the sky at unknown times. For example, sometimes a gravitational wave will come, and again you'll be able to see neutrinos from the gravitational wave, for example. Sometimes. It's called as multi-masonry astronomy. But what's also important is that we are creating an infrastructure in India, it's underground, radiation-free, and can be used for experiments not only in high energy physics but also in biology, material science, and geology. Okay, it's very important that you don't dig a well when you're hungry, right? You start preparing infrastructure for future of Indian science even right now. So we are going to have a large-scale international experiment running in India for the development of experimental physics and development of detector experiments. Okay? So it will be useful. In fact, many of you perhaps might be able to come here and join. With that, I am coming to sort of close of my talk. The career, as you notice from this, is not a process which you decide and go along the same. Okay? It's a process of changing. Okay? We change according to what circumstances around you are, what are the people around you, what are the new discoveries that take place while you are doing. So practical remarks are early years of career are full of uncertainty. You have no clue about what to do. You will have no clue if you will get a PhD over 5 years. You will have no clue if you are going to get a postdoc or a job. Okay? But these uncertainties also come with unforeseen opportunities that come to with accident. You're supposed to catch hold of those uncertainties, catch hold of those opportunities. You have to keep your mind open and your eyes open. It does become stressful and frustrating at times if you don't get any new ideas or new business for a very, very long time. But as I mentioned to you earlier, there is small moments of clarity or new discoveries that are actually make everything really, really well. And third thing is research in physics is not something that you sit and do in your lab or in front of a computer. It's actually a social endeavor. It is important to have friends who talk physics with you. Discussing with colleagues and collaborators is a very important part of doing research, and therefore being in a good scientific community actually helps. IIT Bombay Physics Department, for example, is a very good department, and it does carry out many research. But after all, career in science is a career with immense satisfaction over the long run. So there are ups and downs, but nothing to doubt the overall satisfaction. Let me make some philosophical remarks while leaving. When we are doing our bachelor's, for example, we think that the knowledge that exists is what is in the textbooks. However, that's not really true, because our understanding of the world is changing all around us right now. What we know about particle physics now, a lot of it was not known when I was doing that. Not only I didn't have a clue, but in the world nobody had a clue. Experiments and theory that were done in last 30 years have actually expanded what we do in particles. So this change is brought about by scientists like us, physicists like us. Not only does our work, of course our work contributes to it, also good, but in addition to that, even if your contribution is minuscule, you are actually able to understand, appreciate and communicate this change. So as a physicist, even though I don't work in condensed matter physics, maybe I'm able to understand what's happening in area like quantum computing. Okay, and that is because of my training in physics. And I can understand what it is, I can appreciate, I can take pleasure in that because I didn't discover it, but my colleagues discovered it, and I understand what it is and I can tell it to others. So in some sense, as researchers, we are participants in the process of knowledge creation. So once you go out of your bachelor's or your master's, you should stop thinking of yourself as students, but start thinking of yourself as participants in the process of creation of knowledge. So this is the awareness and motivation and spirit in which we as researchers end up doing. So I leave you with this as my last slide. Okay, this was a career discussion talk. All I can mention to you is career is not something that we decide now. It's a process of learning, and at least in my case, this has taken jumps over many continents and many countries and many topics, very, very important. And well, those who want to do it will definitely enjoy it and find the experience pleasurable, at least in the overall. I will stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions from you for quite some time.
Thanks a lot, sir. That was very, very interesting. We have a lot of questions actually, so let me go one by one. Okay, so one question is, in the beginning you mentioned in your slide about what keeps researchers going, that you need to love what you are doing every day. So Garvit asks that before setting out into academia and research, did you have a clear idea whether you would love it every day, or did you have moments of doubt?
Many moments of doubt. They will come to you many times. Okay. It is important to try many things. Okay. It is important to so for example, when I said I went to Chicago and I joined Collider Experiment, it's not something that happened immediately. There was 1 year when I was trying to look at various things. I went to many faculty members, asked them what they did. I tried to see what they did. I tried to do some calculations. I tried to work in some experiments. Again, I worked in experiments, but I told you I left the experiments after about a year and a half because I thought that I was not very good at it. And also I was a bit more impatient. I more like a butterfly who wants to try many things at once, rather than this focusing and doing things in collaboration of 1,000 people. But everybody has their own way of dealing with things. So after trying that, I figured out that maybe I like this thing called phenomenology, where I can use my theory knowledge, I can use my experience in the experiment that I did for the first 1.5 years and combine these two. I like this borderline. I like talking to theorists about mathematically precise things. I like talking to the experimentalists about exactly how much voltage you should apply on this particular photometric cycle. I like both of these things. Each of you will be liking different things. Okay, so what you like will not be the same as what I like. It's very important to look at many aspects and then somehow choose on one. Okay, for some it might happen in 1 week, for some it might take 5 years. As I gave you this example of Lalita, whose video unfortunately cannot see very well, she actually went to industry, worked there for quite a few years, then realized that maybe she has to come back to academia. She came back. At the age of 30, she started doing her PhD. Then she completed a PhD, and of course, she's now a faculty member at University. So people realize what they really like at different points of time. And don't worry if you don't realize it right now. You may realize it when you are 20 or 25 or 30, sometimes even.
Okay, thank you. That was very inspiring. On that note, there is a question from Sachin. What do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of pursuing a career in academics as a researcher or professor in comparison to industry?
Well, it's very difficult for me to compare with what's happening in industry, because of course industry there are two kinds of things. There's also research and development part, very large in industry. Unfortunately, in India, the research part is, I would say, not given so much prominence, at least from that time. But a lot of my friends have gone to industry and are perfecting. Okay. We just find nowadays that we had and have interest in different things. There are people, for example, who will get a result or get some look at a discovery, try to find out how they can use the discovery and apply it to it. These are application-oriented people. Engineers are very good at it. So if you go to industry, if you have the bent of mind, where you look at something and try to find its application, you will do very well. As a scientist, my frame of mind is, oh, this is something new which I find, wonderful, great new result, let me go and find something else. Okay, so it depends on your mindset and what you really like to do. As I keep on saying to everybody, it just takes time. At some point of time, you figure out what you will do. You have to just be true to yourself. Don't do things because something is prestigious. Don't go to PhD because doing PhD is a very prestigious thing to do. Don't do it because of that. Do it because you like to learn. You like to learn. You can go to both places and have good careers. As examples I have given of many of my classmates. Not all of my classmates did PhD in physics. Some of them did go to industry and they are doing quite well.
Okay, thank you, sir. So there is a question from Sachin. So when you pick your problem that you want to work on during your PhD, how do you make sure that this is the one? Because there are so many problems out there and a lot of them are so interesting. So how can you be sure?
So it is indeed very difficult. So for example, right now, if you are in a vacuum, you will think, yes, in fact, there are 100 problems I can solve. However, as I said, in physics, you don't solve a problem by sitting on your own and just thinking. A subject has developed, that's very difficult. It is very important that around you, you have people who talk that language with whom you can discuss your things. It's very easy to make mistakes. There should be people who can immediately give you feedback whether what you're saying is correct or not. Okay. If you look at this thing, this graph in front of you, you see that I have personally been very influenced by what people around me do. Okay. So at Chicago, a lot of people around me were doing experiments and phenomenology. So I learned from them. So the idea is, if you are able to form a group of people around you with whom you can have good academic discussions, good scientific discussions, that will help you go further. So you could decide on your interests also by what you find around you. About whether you will do your PhD in that problem or not, no one is sure. Okay, so even now I'm in TIFR, I see many students doing PhD. It's not very uncommon that you start doing something, but your PhD is in something very different. Okay, it's not related, but not exactly the problem that you want to solve. You do try working on multiple problems, but which are somewhat related. And finally, those problems you need to succeed are the ones based on right of PhD. It is always good to be broad. If you focus on a very narrow area, there is always a danger of that area, you not being the top person in the area. Then that's not a very good thing in physics. Whereas if you're a broader person, some development happens in a related field, you know exactly what's happening, and then you can tune your research in a way that you can take advantage of whatever is new happening around. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That was nice. There is a question from Ashish. As an engineering student, he says that his interest is in science and mainly in particle physics. So, is it possible to enter into pure sciences, in particular into particle physics, after a BTech in engineering disciplines?
Yes. So it is indeed possible, and nowadays it is also quite easy. Even in India, most of the research institutions have what is called an integrated MSc PhD programs, which means that you do masters and PhD in the same program. These usually they give you more coursework because you also are doing the MSc degree, and you get more time to do your PhD. It's there in TIFR, it's there in many research institutions. So therefore, changing to pure physics, or should I say, changing to pure physics or basic science is not hard at all, because entrance exam is common. As long as you can do the entrance exam and get into that institution, it's perfectly fine. So what you will need to do is essentially you should be familiar with whatever books your corresponding BSc or BTech students in physics read, and that you should be able to. You actually go with a very major advantage, which is that you will understand engineering, and therefore you will be understanding experimental physics. One of the advantages of my BTech education in physics department was that because I had this engineering background, we did a lot of courses in electrical engineering, like digital circuits, analog circuits, instrumentation, and so on. And this actually helped me get a head start when I was doing experimental physics. Because experimental physics is basically, at its heart, is engineering, which is physics modeling. I can give you an example of this India-based neutrino observatory, this picture I showed sometime. Now, to make this, we need not only physicists, we actually need lots of engineers. This detector, which as I said is the largest electromagnet in the world, is going to be built by electrical engineers. The tunnel that we need to build it is going to be by civil engineers. All these people cannot be just somebody who come and do this. They also have to have some knowledge of physics, because they have to know why to build like this, what is it that we need to do in this. Okay, so even for this, you are at an advantage if you have some background in physics, or if you have background in engineering and you are doing physics. So therefore, having, in fact, it is seen that a lot of my friends who are doing physics now and are professors at places actually do come from engineering. So I think these days it is possible, and sometimes with advantages.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from Milind. He asks, according to you, to what extent does somebody's intellect restrict or bind them from pursuing and understanding theoretical physics? I think it's like more of a how smart do you need to be for this kind of question.
Yeah, not much, unfortunately. You have to be hardworking. Okay, there are very few people who can do good work simply by being smart. Okay? But if you have basic amount of intelligence, which I'm sure you have because most of you are in IIT, that basic amount of intelligence is enough. Okay, you just need to combine it with hardware. I think hardware is essential. And apart from that, as I said, it's a question of liking. So I started with mathematical physics, for example. During the process of learning, I found that now at this point of time, I don't think I enjoy rigorous mathematical physics as much as relating, as using my theoretical physics knowledge to explain what's happening in experiments. I like that part. I do not like mathematical physics as much as I thought I would when I was learning. So it's also a question of what exactly do you like doing. So the fact that you cannot do theoretical physics or you do not do theoretical physics can have two reasons. One is that maybe you just like something that's better. And second is, I don't know what the second reason. So second reason is basically that you think your energy is better utilized for doing something. But I think over the long run, hard work is more important than smart.
Thank you. Very great to hear, I think, for everybody. So, seeing that you mentioned that it's very important to be surrounded with a group of people that you can have good academic discussions. So how would you compare the research environment in the different places that you have been? For example, in India versus US versus Europe?
I always made sure, somehow I always was a social person. I did not like to sit at one place in my room, as perhaps my batchmates around there will also do. I did ensure to always try to go to a place where there are a lot of people. Even while trying to go to the university to go to, I chose universities which are big universities. Don't choose small universities. For people who try to go to a place to work with a particular person who may be great in his or her discipline, I recommend caution. Because it is not sure that you will get a lot. So it is not a good idea to go and say, I'm going to go to place XYZ because there is this person ABC who is really great and I want to work with him. Okay, because that may not work. It is good to go to a place where you say, okay, at this place, I have choice of working with X, Y, and Z. And maybe one of them will have way of working with it. That is similar. Okay. So, as at least, let's say, choosing where to do a PhD or where to go for a postdoc, I think it's very important to at least give your first choice to places where you can look at wider spectrum. Does that answer your question?
I think so. It was not mine, but I think they can put it in the chat. So there is, sorry, 1 second, I lost it. There is a question from Samir. So at this point in undergrad, do we need to decide whether we want to go into industry or academia, or what is the point where we should make this decision?
It depends on you. Okay? As I gave you some examples, it's quite possible that you're sure you are going to like doing industry. You can just go at this point of time. I cannot give there's no one size fits all answer. Yeah, so that's all I can say about it.
Right, yeah. A question from Arnav. If we think we have a clear idea of what exact field we want to enter in physics, then should we still actively try to work on other things along the way as well? Or is it okay to focus right away?
My personal suggestion would be still keep your other options open. Because the world is changing very fast. Okay? Which is more true now than it was true in my time, which was almost 2 years. For example, just because of this corona, the ways in which you teach have now changed. People are starting to think about different ways of conducting education online. It is said, which you must have heard very often, that jobs which will exist in 10 years, half of them will not have been created now. They will be of a completely different nature. So it is very important to keep yourself open to be able to work on challenges that come because of change in changing circumstances. So my recommendation would be to keep yourself slightly open. Of course, there are exceptions. I also see some of my students who are so intent on working on just one particular topic that they can go there and succeed. But in general, my advice would be to be slightly.
Okay, thank you, sir. So, on the topic of coronavirus situation, do you have any advice for the students, maybe not who are graduating now, but who will graduate 1 year from now, and then the batches that will follow? Because and do you have any idea? What are your opinions on how the international collaboration or students who plan to go abroad for the studies, how it will affect them?
So of course, this year you already know that it is going to affect those who are going to graduate this year, because perhaps they won't be able to do right now. So again, so what this has taught us, what the coronavirus situation has taught us, is that circumstances can change completely without us expecting what is happening. What I would tell you is, so you are perhaps now being in fact forced to go home and sit home and communicate with the outside world only through internet. This is of course something which is not a good situation. However, I think we should take this as an opportunity. What this does is this forces us to do things that we had not thought of doing. Some of the students that I know have started doing internships which can be done online. These internships may not have to be done with research, for example. This could simply be internship that do with certain companies. Certain companies need certain jobs to be done online. Physicists typically have an advantage in this sense because they learn a lot of tricks. The variety of subjects that are normally taught in physics education enable you to do lots of things. You can solve differential equations. You can do computation, you can do programming, and see how to do it. There are many branches or many areas or many companies which may need such experience. Now, if you wanted to try out something else, which is slightly away from your standard academic sort of road that you get, and take a slight detour and come back, this is the time. Because this is a time when you can do these things and nobody will ask you why did you spend your time out. So try to use this as an opportunity to try out things that you have never tried yet. Because always there's the pressure of giving a midterm exam next week and submitting a project the week after that, and so on and so on. If you're free from that, do something different. Try to also get some other life skills, because you never know how it will come in. I give you some examples of what I did during my IIT and so on. I had no clue that later on they will come out to be handy. But it just turns out, maybe by stroke of chance, that something that I learned outside of what I was going to do ended up actually being used. I learned something new. Use this opportunity.
Yes, thank you. That's excellent ideas. But so this is, I guess, a bit from my side as well. What will the future of experiments and experimental physics look like? And will this be a limited effect, maybe just until the next few months, or will this have some more long-lasting effects?
I doubt. Okay, I doubt that we will not be able to find a solution to this. I think a solution will be found. Okay? Whether in the next few months or next year, that depends on how things progress. But yeah, there's no reason to think that we cannot overcome. So life will come back, perhaps not to the same normal that we think I used to thinking of it as. But as far as careers are concerned, the basic um, ways of doing research, even in exploring physics, is not going to change. And you will find less time to go to somebody's room. So, for example, AFR, if I thought of a question and can't find answer to, I would walk out of my room, go to my next room, and go knock on the door and ask the question. Now I change that habit to saying, "Oh, wonderful! I just call somebody, say, okay, I'll have a Zoom meeting with you very quickly, and I'll ask." In such small ways, I think our ways of doing physics might change, but otherwise it will not change. Because finally, remember, all said and done, physics is an experimental. You have to be able to do experiments. I will not perhaps do experiments with 10 people together in a lab, but I may do experiments one by one, or I may be able to do two with proper facilities. So I do not think that the ways of doing physics will change. But again, be ready for unexpected. Anything might happen. And that's why I always say it's always good to be broad and be able to just catch whatever ball is thrown.
Yes, thank you. That's very hopeful. Namishka asks, how did you go about choosing your mentors and how did they help you along your journey?
So mentors are very important, and choice of mentors is very important. A couple of things that I may mention. First thing is, of course, that your interest should overlap, which is the topic of physics. You should like what that person does, because the person won't accept you always. Don't choose a person simply because he or she is very famous, very popular, very intelligent, or very good. That is not a good idea. Choose a person whose way of functioning is also way of functioning that you like. Some people like to be left alone, and they would ask their students to work alone. Some mentors like to chat with you every day. You may not like these extremes. You have to choose. You have to see which is the way. Like a person who calls you every day at 2 o'clock and pays attention to you, or somebody who says, okay, come back after 2 weeks. That's something we should do. It's always good to look for a mentor who, in principle, gives you time. Don't try to go to somebody who has 25 students. Go to somebody who has 2, 3, 4, 5. It also means that you get some more time in this. So think of all these things before you do it. Because mentors are almost like some sense. They, in the whatever 2, 3, 4 years that you work with them, you will absorb whatever it is. So yes, so this choice is quite crucial. So don't look at external things. Ask, for example, ask the seniors who have been mentored by the same person about their experience. You do want to have mentors who are kind, who give time to you, and who are serious to this. So the mentors that I had luckily turned out to be quite nice. In Chicago, I had Professor Wah, as I said earlier, also at Professor Rosberg, who was the PhD. None of these people asked me to do things because they wanted me to. All of them, fortunately, left me free to do what I like to do, and then showed interest in what I do. So that's the kind of mentor you want. Somebody who shows interest in what we do and guides you properly. For example, this mentor in ICPP who went to this conference, came with this slide and gave the slide to me. So that's the kind of people you want to. It takes some kind of. Not everybody gets such nice mentors, but among the ones that you have a choice of, at least try to choose right ones.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Drishti asks, how do we explore as many fields as possible during our undergrad without risking having not much knowledge of any particular field in depth? So, how do you maintain this balance?
Okay, I'll ask the question. You want to answer. You might be able to convince your professors to give very short talks about what research they work with. I don't know if this happens in IIT these days, but I think that's a very, very good thing to do. It also would be a good thing, like you just had this talk by me, I perhaps have a series of talks. Just get people to come and talk to you. Physics department in particular, of course, every year maybe 30, 40 people graduate. Many of them would be very happy to come and give a talk. Or in fact, now that everything is online, they may be able to come and online tell you about their talk. So good thing might be to contact the alumni of your department and try to choose the ones that you find interesting. Let them give you talk. Let them tell you about what you do. I think that's a good way to get exposed to it.
Okay, thanks. Question by Sachin. So, if you're working on an experiment or maybe even theory, but and you don't get any results, then do institutes allow you to shift your research area or your institute itself, given that you've spent a large amount of funds on your research so far?
So it depends. India, of course, they do. It is a question of convincing funding agencies about my area. Of course, in the area like hydrogen physics, where experiments are very big, there's a collective decision to tell the people about whether to pursue a particular area. Okay, so it is true that even later on in life, you will have to work hard on convincing funding agencies about why it is that what you are doing is important. This happens in all the cases. Normally, good institutions allow people to shift area that they're working on. There are some examples.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from Samir. How much do we need to think about money and aspects related to money while deciding what we should pursue ahead?
So the salaries of academic people in India are quite high. This was not the situation perhaps 30 years ago when I graduated, but these days the salaries of people in India are quite high. I may not compare them with the salaries that you get in industry, okay. But just to give a random estimate, I think that joining assistant professor in IIT Bombay, it's about a lakh a month. So that's the kind of estimation as a. Okay. So I think that if you like doing physics, financial, how much you will get financially should not be much of your concern. The concern, of course, is that getting a job in a good place is, of course, uncertainty. People know. There are a lot of institutions that have come up. For example, you of course know that now there are how many IITs have been lost count of the order of 25, many ICERs. Okay. And all of these places are growing. The number of jobs available then will grow. So if you are a good person, good physicist, I think getting a job is perhaps will not be so difficult. Of course, you want to get the job in a particular set of institutions that still has a lot of competition and will be hard. However, we are expecting that community of physicists in India will keep on growing and will also become better connected. Because of, in fact, one good thing that Corona has done is that now seminars and colloquia happening in many places are just becoming open to everyone. So which means that there are some lectures that perhaps only 30 people in PIFR will attend, now they can be attended by 200 people in each institution. So therefore, things are getting more connected and community is growing. Therefore, I think as long as you get academic position, I think the amount of salary you get perhaps will be the least of it.
Okay, sir. Thank you. That is reassuring. Swarnim asks, is doing a PhD abroad necessary to get a good position in India? And how much of an advantage is it?
Okay, so quick answer is of course not necessary. I think about half my colleagues in PIFR are those with PhDs in India. So it's not necessary at all. On the other hand, I think it's a good idea. And the reason for that is different places have different modes of functioning. So when I was in IIT, I looked at I saw the faculty members and how they work, how they do the research. I went to Chicago and I saw that people had different ways of it. Keep to time, exactly start at time, end at a time. No, don't care for. Don't take holidays. No, from day to Friday, do exactly. I went to Europe. I saw other ways of people. People who would take long vacations because long vacation is the part of the Europeans too. But then you come back and then you just work to complete focus. People work differently in different places. The experience of working in different places is very important. And therefore, I think it's important to be a student or a postdoc in multiple places. Yes, I will not say you have to be multiple places around the world. That's not essential, but it does help. So having experience at other places actually helps. Also, when you later on find a job, sometimes the fact that you have worked at many places and still continue to be productive is taken as a positive point, because what that means is it is not that suppose let's say you are working in IIT, you're working with some Professor X and you have written 20 papers to Professor X. It's possible that contribution was made by Professor X and not by you. Nobody can distinguish. On the other hand, if on the same topic you did good work from IIT Bombay, you did good work from Chicago, you did good work from IISER Pune, and you did good work from Max Planck Munich, people see that at all these places you have done this particular kind of work, and this will assure them that you are an expert in this. Okay, so in that sense also, being able to work in different places helps. So country-wise, it may or may not make a difference, but I would still recommend that experience across countries is a good thing to do, but it is not essential to be able to do it.
Okay, thank you, sir. That's a very interesting perspective. Arvind has asked, what is a typical day in research life look like?
If I tell you a typical day now, it will be very boring. So I will not do typical. I will tell you of a typical day as it was maybe 4 months ago. Okay, again it will depend on every person, but I will tell you a typical day in the life of a theoretical physicist. So what kind of thing we do. So if you perhaps have heard of this thing called archives, which is a website where every day preprints appear. So whoever does some research, before it gets published, but before they send it to a journal, they usually go on the archive. Every day, your subject, maybe some 10 papers coming out. So for me, one nice good thing to do is perhaps to open archive in the morning and see what is it that people in interesting areas did in the world today. Out of those 10 papers, you not understand 8. 1 or 2 you find interesting, and then you talk about the interesting papers to your students or your fellow faculty members, maybe over lunch and maybe by going to They will in general be many open problems that you are working on, with your students or with your collaborators, and throughout the day you will have meetings with them to discuss this. Maybe there are some problems on which you work alone, but most of my problems are collaborative, so I talk with them. You will probably writing papers. Some of the time will be spent writing papers, making sure things are accurate. You may have to, for example, you often get some papers to referee. Journals in the papers asking you, does this paper look reasonable? What are the comments on that? A place like TIFR or IIT Bombay, there are many classes, not classes, many seminars that happen in a day, every day maybe one or two. You go and attend them. Sometimes there are student talks and so on, organize conferences. So that's the kind of thing that the theories does. So a lot of it depends on what you do. So you do your calculation. You look at experimental websites, look at the data. These archives, for example, also have papers which tell you about what results they have got, discuss those results, how to interpret them, and so on. So that's the way we do it. I'm an experimentalist. Perhaps some of my day will go in actually setting up my experiments, getting data. Some experiments run over days or sometimes over months. I will do that. If I'm somebody who does computation, I will be trying to run a program on many machines simultaneously and parallelly, and that will take place. That's overall a day. What I do. So what makes it new is not the routine. The routine doesn't really change, but what makes it new is the topic that you think about. So every few weeks or so, you have something new to think about, something new in this.
Okay, thank you. Samir has asked, is it difficult to get grants or funding in theoretical high energy physics as compared to other fields?
Not really. I mean, it's neither easy nor difficult. It all depends on exactly what you do. You have to be able to show that what you're going to do is something unique and that you have some new ideas, and it is as difficult or as easy as others.
Okay. Arnav has asked, how much room is there for creativity for a theorist?
Quite a bit actually. Theories is not bound by many things that makes it easy. For example, if you're an experimental collaboration, then you cannot work with other collaborations. If you're a theorist, you have sort of that freedom. Also, creative in the sense there's data for lots of experiments. The situation right now is, although many people are working on this, there are many open problems for which there are no solutions. And remember, when I say there are no solutions, it means there are no solutions even after there's hundreds of people who worked on these problems for a few years, which means that the problems are difficult. Okay. It's possible that everybody has missed something, maybe something very small that you can think of. That is creativity. Or you could come up with a very different way of thinking about a problem. That is creativity. Or you could point out a flaw in some kind of proof that somebody has done, and then you say, okay, this is a flaw, so there's a loophole, and you can work around this loophole and you can make sense of the observation. That's creativity. So in theoretical physics, there is of course there's a lot of scope for creativity.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think this we can take as our final question. So from Praveen, if you had to sort of summarize all the great advice that you have given into one thing as the primary takeaway for somebody who wants to pursue a career in physics, what would that be?
You choose what you like to do and you work hard at it. I think that's basically the key. Choose what you like to do and you work hard at it. That's basically it.
Excellent. That is great. Yeah. I think that is all the questions, at least that I was able to read from the huge amount of questions that we have got today. So yeah, I think that's it for now. Thank you very much for your talk, Dr. Dike. We really enjoyed it, and especially I think given these times of uncertainty, it was even more valuable for all of us. If there is anything else you would like to say as concluding remarks, then please go ahead.
Well, not really. I mean, I'll just repeat what I said last time.
Yes.
See that you like to do and work harder. That's it.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending today's talk.